Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khaled Musallam, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today for this peer seminar. I know it's a very busy time of the year with exams and all that, but thank you for coming. I don't know if when Grace and Laurie decided on the time for this talk, they knew something that is going to be 2 earthquakes happening the weekend right before. So it seems they know something about the early warning system. It's amazing the timing of this talk that's very relevant to the recent 2 earthquakes in Japan and in Ecuador. So it's very timely. I'm not going to take too much time in introducing the speaker. Laurie Johnson is a visiting project scientist at the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. And she has a very broad education with 2 degrees from Texas A&M in geophysics and in urban planning. She also has a PhD or doctor in informatics from Kyoto University. So her education spans several areas and also several countries. Laurie has been very active as an urban planner, specialist, and disaster recovery and catastrophe risk management in the risk management area. She has been active in research and consulting on recovery planning and management following many of the world disasters, and we are going to hear about that in a minute. She is a member of the U.S. Geological Survey Science Application for Risk Reduction. She is also chairs the U.S. National Advisory Committee for Earthquake Hazard Reduction, and she is in the steering committee of GEAR, the Geotechnical Extreme Event Reconnaissance Organization, and in the board of director of SPUR, also a very important organization that deal with San Francisco Bay Area civic and good governance organization. So without further delays, I will let Laurie take the podium to tell us about post-earthquake reconnaissance to risk from 1906 until now, maybe minus the last 2 events, unless you manage to get something in there.
So in talking with Grace about doing this presentation, I thought it would be interesting to think about responses, post-earthquake responses, not in the structural sense. We know that most of our code changes really occur post-event as we observe damage to different structures and different lifeline systems, and we incorporate those lessons into the next update of the building code. And instead, what I wanted to talk about is more the larger scale community responses to risk. And since today is April 18th and it's the 110th anniversary of the 1906 earthquake, we thought it'd be fun to start with that earthquake. And so I think Charlie was out at Lotus Fountain this morning. Was anybody else there to commemorate it? If you don't know, every year there still is a commemoration that happens at the time of the earthquake, which is 5/12, that's right. And so 110 years ago at 5:12 a.m., the Bay Area was rocked by this massive earthquake, and then fires also broke out. And the fires actually burned for 4 days and destroyed about 80% of the city's property value. It was the 6th time the city had burned since it was actually developed in the mid-1800s. And many people had insurance for fire, but not for earthquake, something similar to today's situation. And so in the aftermath of the fire, there was a real push to actually kind of downplay the earthquake part of the damage and upplay the fire part of the damage. And so with time, even the headlines began to talk about the percentage of damage being caused more proportionally by fire than by earthquake. And this was really, in part, also researchers have looked back and said, at the time, the information that was coming out about the earthquake damage or danger and what the future risk of earthquakes would be from people like Gilbert, who led one of the major studies, if you've ever looked at that. Also, there was a state investigation committee that was set up to look at lessons. That stuff came very slowly and was often very technical. People weren't very familiar with the kinds of terms and information about seismology at the time. It was a sort of a young field. So it became much more of a simpler thing to focus on the risk of fire and also because of the repeated experience with it, to begin to try to address that in some more organized way. Building codes were adopted, but there's evidence as well that they weren't adhered to in the mass rebuilding effort. This is an image of the extent of the burn area. And so the waterfront is on your right, and to the left, the boundary is roughly kind of going between Van Ness, modern-day Van Ness Avenue, over to about Divisadero. So a huge swath of the city. If you look at, is my pointer going to work? Right about here is where the modern Civic Center resides, kind of right in this area. So it gives you a sense of how big the impact area was. And here's a view of actually what the city looked like at that point, which is at Post and Gary, where I just had the star. So sort of around the Union Square area in the aftermath. One of the big reasons for trying to kind of emphasize the fire also was because people back east were familiar with fire, but they weren't as familiar with earthquakes, and there was a real push to try to get money. And also get money for the rebuilding. And also what was interesting is that real estate values really restored themselves within a few months, about 4 months, according to one study, looking back over time. And so the interest was there to rebuild the city and to rebuild it quickly. There's some really interesting stories about a plan that had been developed by Daniel Burnham, a very famous urban designer, who wanted to create a number of different boulevards diagonally across the city, break up the grid that existed in the city. This plan was developed before the earthquake, and many of the local leaders wanted to put that plan in place after the earthquake. And there was a real push to not take out some of the historic neighborhoods, particularly cultural resources like Chinatown, and to go through the process of reconfiguring the platting of the city. And so most of the existing road network stayed in place, but there were elements of the plan that actually were adopted. So this just is something that was done for the 100th anniversary, showing Burnham's vision up at the top, or blown up here, where he wanted a lot more park systems across the city. And what you see in these sort of progressions of time in those little images at the top is how we actually ended up getting some of those. And there are a number of other features, including like a subway under Market Street, and an expansion of the area around Fisherman's Wharf to be more of an attraction. Many things actually came into being, which is quite interesting. But what was interesting is in terms of the response to the fire in particular, was really the construction of the auxiliary water supply system. How many are familiar with this? Have you heard about it? Someone here is an expert on it, so Charlie can answer more in-depth questions about it. But in 1908, a city engineer, Marsden Manson, studied around the world to look at how fire was dealt with, and actually proposed that there be this secondary high-pressure system installed. And essentially, the system uses gravity, in which there are some reservoirs, which are noted here on this map, that then serve a second piping system throughout the older part of the city. To provide an extra water supply that would just be there for firefighting, because so many of the existing water system had been damaged. There were thousands of breaks in the earthquake itself. And so this was a massive effort. It was the only public investment actually voted into place that the public agreed to fund after the earthquake. So a bond effort was actually passed in 1909. And this system was constructed. And Charlie is now very involved. The system still exists today. It was used minimally. There were some problems in 1989, but it still was used. The city's gone through, these maps are from an upgrade process. They started in 2009, and there's a massive upgrade process going on right now. We're still one of the only cities, I think the only city in the world to have this auxiliary water supply system. Maybe not, now there are others, okay. But we were the only for a long time. And other parts of the bay don't have that, which is really one of our big vulnerabilities in the East Bay, is that we don't have this auxiliary water supply, and our water system is still quite brittle and vulnerable to failure in a major earthquake. Just something else, one other legacy of Daniel Burnham's plan was the Civic Center that you know today and may think is quite lovely. He had proposed the whole city be done in this Beaux-Arts style of architecture, and it was actually finally implemented at the Civic Center. A design competition was held in 1912, and here you can see construction, the state of construction of the Civic Center in 1915, in which the new City Hall has been erected and what is now the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium was in place, but many of the other buildings weren't there. This is another image of the plaza somewhere in the 1930s. And the point really is that I want to make too is that in one of the few studies of long-term reconstruction, which was done by a group led by Eugene Haas, and it's called Reconstruction after a following disaster. And what he showed was that there are these periods in which you have activities of emergency response, restoration, what he called Reconstruction 1, which is replacement reconstruction of things kind of like for like, and then Reconstruction 2, which is really more commemorative rebuilding or betterment. And so risk and dealing with large-scale community risk really falls into the Reconstruction 2 category. And this scale is a logarithmic scale. And his point really was that in observing not only San Francisco, but Anchorage, Alaska, Managua, Nicaragua, a number of other cities that had had large-scale damage in the early 1900s, to mid-1900s, he proposed that each of these stages is exponentially longer than the previous stage. And so to do large-scale risk reduction, to do betterment, to do commemorative rebuilding like the Civic Center really takes at least 10 years and possibly longer. And that's one of the major themes of my talk. So now I'm going to turn to Kobe, Japan, and talk a little bit about what happened there. Again, a fire ensued after the earthquake. And there were 6,400 people lost their lives. Over 100,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. This is a view from the apartment of one of the planners who ended up having a leading role in rebuilding the city. And this is a map. Actually, students helped perform a region-wide building and damage inspection process, or just building safety assessment process, and sort of categorizing buildings in sort of our ATC kind of styles. Heavily damaged, moderately damaged, or lightly damaged. And on this map are circles of where the areas were most heavily damaged, and the city decided to propose what they called restoration promotion districts. So there are about 11 of these. That number kind of changed with time up to 13 because a couple separated. But what they were really saying is the rest of the city could get on with rebuilding as was. There were going to be some upgrades to building codes. But in these areas, they were going to take time to plan in a more structured way. And they used two different kinds of processes for those. I've listed up here. One is called redevelopment. The other one's called land readjustment. Redevelopment is quite similar to what we have in the United States as redevelopment, although our Governor Brown abolished it in California. But it's essentially that you could sort of put your arm around an entire area and essentially value all those rights and redevelop that area, acknowledging those rights, and also get an increment of income off that area from whatever value is accrued over time. Sort of helps finance the rebuilding in that area. Same is true in Japan. Land readjustment is something that's more common in Germany and a few other places, not so much in the United States. And really what it does is you essentially put your arms around a certain area, and then you also value the rights of the ownership of land, the structures, and the occupancy, but those rights can be reconfigured within that area, and everybody proportionally loses a bit. And that bit goes towards things like widening streets or adding in parks. And in the case of Kobe, they did this throughout the city in order to create a better environment to fight fires. So the streets were very narrow. Buildings had collapsed into the streets. They also struggled with firefighting water supplies and capacity across the city. And so these parks were put in as places in which they could actually store supplies for post-earthquake needs. And I'll show you some images of that. And then also the streets were widened so that in future events, fire trucks could get through and other emergency response vehicles could get through in the event of large-scale damage. This took many years to do. And here's just an example of the kind of work that planners had to do in the neighborhoods with residents. In Japan, all residents have to agree. You have to, if you have a right, you have to actually sign on to this process. And you have to get all property owners in agreement in order to proceed. So it was a very elaborative consultation process, and it took many years to complete. And here's just an image of one of these widened streets. You see a little stream feature along the side. This actually also provides an auxiliary water supply. Here's another image of a larger park in which there's a community center that serves as just a neighborhood meeting center for activities, but it's also stocked with supplies for earthquakes. One of my colleagues is sitting on what looks like a bench, but those are actually latrines ready to be used after an earthquake. And then again, the water features in which water is actually stored in a cistern underneath this system. And this is one of the large-scale redevelopment areas in which there's, again, a large park that can be a meeting place. There's a new community center, supplies, and those various things are also stored here as well. And you can see how the density is actually quite dense around this. As they moved back and got that extra land, then the rights of people had to be accumulated elsewhere. And so the density is higher in order to both accommodate everybody, accommodate the new addition of parks, but also finance this redevelopment project by selling off new units for new people to move in. But that's on the east side of the city, which is closer to Osaka and the major metropolitan working place for the region. This is actually the other redevelopment area. It's on the west side of the city. It's further away from the major job market, and it's really struggled. This is an image I just took a little over, it'll be coming, it's a year and a half now, and you can see that buildings that were proposed are still being reconstructed, and actually all the heights of these have been reduced dramatically because there just is no market for it. So it's risky stuff to do this kind of large-scale redevelopment, and that's my second point. Here's an image of Kobe today. It's quite dense. It's quite lovely. It's a great place to go. If you haven't been there, I totally encourage you, and you can walk around. You can learn all these things because they're evident everywhere throughout the city. So now I'm going to turn to Sichuan China, an earthquake magnitude 7.8 in 2008. This is an image of Sichuan, which is one of the towns in the mountains. It was up, a lot of the damage was concentrated up in the mountains, as I'll explain. And here you see actually two areas in which landsliding has majorly impacted the valley floor and the buildings down there. This is an image showing those two landslides and how they came down and affected sort of the older part of the city and the new part of the city as well. The Chinese government has actually kept Sichuan, the old Sichuan, as we call it now, this is all old Sichuan, as a memorial, and you can actually go and see the damage and walk through the collapsed and wonky structures, and also images of the landslide, and it's a quite stunning place to go to. The national government took a very active role in planning for the rebuilding of this region, and this actually is just showing how geology played a major key. And so they actually defined 3 areas of suitability, areas that were suitable for reconstruction, those that were suitable for sort of appropriate reconstruction, and that area, particularly the mountain area, that would be retained as an ecological reserve. And about, as you can see, 63% of this land was in that area. And so this actually fit into an overall goal that China has had for a while, which is to move people out of the more rural areas and concentrate development in the larger metropolitan areas, and also concentrate services and jobs in those areas. So it's the whole moving from sort of the agricultural, older China economy to the industrial economy of today. And so this plan kind of fit right within that context and the time in which the government wanted to do this. They invested about equivalent of US $200 billion in implementing this plan. Here's an image of what was one of the elements of that plan, talking about these 3 categories of suitability. So the most suitable areas down in the flatlands in green, and then you can see the other 2 areas kind of spread out across the mountainous area. 2 towns were actually proposed to be relocated. One was Sichuan, which I showed you. Another one was Qingchuan. And in both cases, most of these towns had serious ground failures from fault rupture, landsliding, and also had lost a tremendous number of people and buildings as well. And so the provincial government approved this, and relocation sites were selected. They were down in that green area. And this is just some images kind of pasted together to show you New Sichuan. What's really interesting, this is actually taken in 2011. A very small number, maybe 10,000 people had moved in at the time. There's still a lot to be developed. And one of the big issues has been that one of the things that many of these communities did was try to accentuate their historic cultural resources and make these tourist attractions too. And so you ended up actually with a number of communities competing for each other. You have these like tourist towns trying to talk about the native Chinese ethnic groups doing dances and things like that. But now they're all competing with each other, and the economy is actually, jobs haven't come there. The industry that was supposed to be developed there is slow to come as well. So these areas have ended up with a lot of challenge. People are still actually going back to the mountain to farm and haven't been able to find jobs down here. And so now they have these really extensive commutes because they can't live up there, but they still have land or access to land up there that they can farm. So now I'm going to turn to Christchurch, New Zealand, and get a little closer to where we are today in time. And this series of earthquakes impacted the city in 2010, 2011. This is an image of the dust cloud rising from the building collapses in downtown Christchurch on the second big earthquake, February 22nd, 2011. So they just had their 5-year anniversary. But what I'm going to talk about is actually the liquefaction damage and how that's been dealt with. So there was repeated liquefaction and subsidence, especially in the eastern part of the city, which is close to the ocean, where the soils, actually the water table is quite high. There's an old river delta and swamp and wetlands throughout there, and these are just some images from that where you can see how the land is actually very unsettled now. New Zealand has a nationally backed earthquake insurance program that also includes an element for land damage. So what the government was essentially facing in repairing these houses, the program is only for residential properties, by the way. And so what the government was facing was that as there were repeated earthquakes, which were happening about every 6 months, these areas were having liquefaction damage again. And so finally, in June 2011, when another sequence of earthquakes hit, the national government voted, the prime minister and his cabinet led a decision to actually offer a buyout to the most heavily damaged areas. So rather than trying to repair these areas again and again, that they would just buy them out. So this is something we do quite commonly in the US for repetitive flood losses. And there's a whole history of that you can find online if you're interested. But it's not been done very often for ground failure. And so it's been a topic I've been particularly interested in studying. So here's a map. Actually, it was released in June of 2011. This map has kind of changed with time, so I've tried to capture an image back from that time period. But what they did was they sort of zoned the entire residential building stock that was affected by the earthquakes. And they put them into, first for the foundation repairs, they identified 3 categories of foundation repair. So they called them technical categories, or TC 1, 2, and 3. And then the red zone, as you can see there, includes this flat land that I was showing you that had a lot of liquefaction, as well as some of the hillside areas that had rock falls and the risk of future rock falls and aftershocks. And so what happened then was that to repair houses in technical category 3 meant a site investigation. It meant people from geotech. Anybody here? Is this Stefan here? No. John Bray's group. John Bray, if you know Professor Bray, he's been very involved in this. But they had to come up with new designs. These were difficult to do. You had to do investigations on the site. You had to figure out how to redesign that foundation. So a huge part of the city was now caught not only in the buyout process, but also in this upgrade for higher foundation designs that were not easily met by current foundation practices. So in the end, I just want to talk a little bit about what happened. So this buyout was offered to people. You had 2 options, which I described down here. One was that you could sell both your land and your house to the government, And in many cases, people had additional insurance on their home besides the basic policy the government offers. And so what that meant is that you were selling or giving the government both your national government earthquake insurance policy returns, but also giving them whatever your private insurer was insuring on top of that. So you just essentially said, here, take it, you negotiate with the private insurer, you figure it out. About 23% of the people accepted that option. About 77% of the people accepted the other option, which is that they sold their land to the government, but they kept their insurance policy. They thought, well, hey, I'll continue to negotiate with them. I may get a better deal in terms of the final settlement on my house, and I'll apply that to a new house. Well, what ended up happening, because so many properties were actually in a state of repair, especially a repair process that was sort of protracted because of the number of houses that were having to upgrade their foundations, you had a squeeze that happened in the market. And essentially prices, both for rentals and for sale construction, rose overnight by, they tripled within 2 years. And so people were being essentially pushed out of the region, pushed very far to the north or the west, away from where they had lived before. It's still a fairly small area, but it's actually had all sorts of ripple effects. Schools weren't being rebuilt in the right places. Infrastructure wasn't in the right places in terms of the repair cycle. New roads and capacity for dealing with traffic wasn't being developed appropriately to the north and the west to handle the new people there. A similar issue has gone on in the downtown area, where they've kept a cordon in place for 2 years to try to evaluate the safety of structures and more efficiently demolish structures downtown. And that similarly displaced about 55,000 workers, about 6,000 businesses. So what you've had essentially is a kind of a series of resettlements going on over time across the landscape of the Canterbury Plain. And it's still continuing as downtown starts to redevelop, and as finally housing is coming online to absorb the 7,000 houses that were bought out. And what's interesting is when you talk to people, although there hasn't been a detailed study, the government's doing a study of this now, the people who selected option one and did that quickly, they were able to find a house at relatively the same cost. But everybody else ended up having to pay 20%, 50%, even 100% more. In many cases had to tap into their savings, or as I said, just be displaced altogether because they couldn't find a property with the value that they were able to get out of the damages from the earthquake. And this is just some images of the red zone. This is where you see where somebody had actually marked, and I did this to scale for a reason, the green zone on one side of the street lamp and the red zone on the other. And here's that image today in that same street lamp, and you can see a bought out area over here to the left. They are just now beginning the replanning process at 5 years for these areas. Because this isn't, this is something, unlike floods where you really should just set back from the floodplain, in this case, the land can be remediated and it'll be more efficient to do it now that everything's been removed. So they can actually go through and do a lot of things that we do here in the Bay Area, where they actually try to dehydrate the soil to an extent, compact it, raise it, and these might be redevelopable, but it's quite contentious to do that because people feel they sold their home, they gave up their home, and they want to see this turned into a park, some sort of commemorative use, a public use of some sort. But the government owns this and is now working with the local governments to figure out what to do. So it's probably going to be a 2 or 3 year planning process before any reconstruction actually begins. Last place I want to talk about is Tohoku, Japan, and the tsunami and earthquake of 2011. I think the response to risk has really been far more about the tsunami than the earthquake shaking, and it's commensurate with the damage. If you see footage of the tsunami coming in, you can see that many structures performed well. Japan has great building codes, but what the tsunami was really the devastating factor in which over 16,000 people perished. After the earthquake, the national government set up a national level reconstruction design council, and they came up with some initial concepts that would really guide the national government's investment in the rebuilding of this area, in which they said that we want to see a series of mitigations and resistance to tsunamis. So you might have the breakwater out in the ocean, you might have a levee on land, but then you'd actually might have a secondary levee. You'd also reorganize the uses so that people weren't living in the most vulnerable areas, and instead you might put lower density activities like industrial functions, or your fishing functions still need to be there. But essentially you could get people, and as many people, away from the most vulnerable areas. There were a number of types or approaches in which they came up with these concepts in which you could do it. So these basically go through and talk about how you could relocate people up to the hills, or you could actually do these double levees, etc. And what really emerged out of this was the idea of 2 levels of tsunami risk. And this has really become quite embedded in the lexicon now in policy and dealing with this particular area, but also in other places in Japan. So really the first idea being, what is the sort of 100-year, 1% annualized probability event versus what is the 0.1% annualized probability event, the 1,000-year kind of tsunami. So they call these level 1 and level 2 tsunamis. And so in the first approach, really they wanted to construct levees that dealt with level 1 risk, but deal with level 2 risk through structural approaches like backup levees, but also non-structural approaches like relocating people out of the most vulnerable areas. So land use regulations really kicked in here as well. They went through a very elaborate process in which technical experts modeled the tsunami risk and came up with that 100-year return period height. They then looked at various configurations. Here, what you see for the town of Natori is if you put in the levee, then how does that change the flood risk? If you have different heights, what does that do? If you move people out of it, what were the losses? So this all went on in the first year after the tsunami. And then they actually came up with, going back to some of that stuff I talked about before, what programs were they going to essentially move the money down and use? What tools were they going to use to actually make this happen? So land readjustment that I showed you in Kobe is one of the major ways in which they're doing it. But rather than using land readjustment to widen streets and add parks, what they're doing in this case is they're actually raising the land. And they're raising the land by an enormous amount, as you're going to see. The second approach they did, which is something they've used in a couple of other earthquakes, and is something they use in normal planning processes, is called collective relocation. So similar to land readjustment, all the property rights owners have to agree to this process, and they essentially agree to collectively move together to a new place. So they find a new site, and they actually move together. In both of those cases, the government, through the municipalities, from the national government down to the local governments, will pay for all of this sort of physical work of raising the land or preparing a new site for the relocation, in some cases buying that land, and putting in all the infrastructure. But it's still up to the individuals to reconstruct their houses. And this was a largely uninsured risk or loss for a lot of people. So this is coming out of their own personal pockets. So to offset that, because a lot of people are elderly, they're on fixed incomes, they don't have the resources, there's also a public housing program to create a large amount of public housing. This is being done at a massive scale. While there were like a dozen of these being done in Kobe, there are now, almost 100 of these kinds of projects going on across a massive region that is essentially like all of Northern California. So it's a big region, it's a lot to be managed, but interestingly, they're on their way. Here's what you see is sort of the flatland of Rikusen Takeda City, one of the cities, in 2012. So they're still clearing debris. They're temporarily kind of elevating some roads just to move around because some of this land had subsided during the earthquake, so it was being impacted by tidal effects. Here's the plan for the city, which was essentially the area in pink is where they're going to do this massive land raising. And then the area in yellow up in the hills is where these new residential relocations are going to be located. And then this is actually an image of the hillside housing relocation initiated. And sorry, it was very, the air was very hazy that day, but you can see up in the hills where they're doing grading, and then they set up a system in which they actually by conveyors brought that material down to the flatlands, and you can see these little mounds here, which is where they're actually doing the land raising operation. And here's another image of the land raising, and here just to give you a sense of it, This is just taken by my colleague a couple of months ago, but you can see how high it is, and yet the roads are still down at a lower level. And you begin to wonder what this is really going to be like to live in a place like this. And so obviously what's happened now is as time's progressed, people are starting to question whether they really want this in their jurisdictions. There are large seawalls that have been put in place, and so there's now actually in many communities a backlash towards this. But the cat is sort of out of the bag, the train has left the station, and the national government's very committed that in order to rebuild, it wants to make sure people are safe first. So thus far, where there have been disputes in some of the cities, the prevailing sentiment has been to continue with these projects. There's been like a tweaking of levee height, a meter or so in some places, but not a removal of these systems in any places. So what does this all mean? So back to Haas and Cates, and this is their model timeline that came out of that study that I referred to about 1906, in which they talked about these 4 phases, and the idea that this kind of large-scale reconstruction that includes betterment can take exponentially longer. So really, in that phase, the efforts, as I mentioned, are really to commemorate the event, to do post-disaster betterment or improvement, and to serve the city's future. These projects are usually quite large, and they tend to be financed by the government. This is not something individuals can easily undertake by themselves. It requires, obviously, a lot of cooperation, but that requires management on top of that to make that happen. The activity essentially extends the recovery period twice or even more. As I showed you with Kobe 20 years later, they're still in those particular areas dealing with aspects of recovery. The other point I want to make is that community resilience is not just about the physical space. And I'm an urban planner, so I spend a lot of time looking at that. But really, sitting on top of the environmental and the sort of built environment, our economies, governmental institutions, and the people and the social fabric of our communities. And so when disasters happen, all these things get perturbed. It's not just about the land being damaged or the structures being damaged, but everything has been disrupted. And what that really means is that everything is now more tightly coupled, in that if you could do one of these large-scale projects, we do redevelopment all the time, but we have the time to do that. And we take the time to kind of think of what the impacts are, and we're able to actually make adjustments and mitigations for those. But post-disaster, because things are in such a state of flux, even the best efforts to try to anticipate what the impacts are going to be of these projects, typically we find that there are the unintended consequences, like rising house values, and they weren't anticipating that. So it's just something that we're learning, that redevelopment and doing this large-scale work post-disaster is actually much more complicated. One of the reasons for that is actually what we feel is really unique about the post-disaster situation, which is something we call time compression. And so really what it is that the disaster event sort of takes out a number of capital services across all of those different systems at the same time. And so in order to put them back, you actually have to do that in a much shorter time period. A city that took 100 years to construct now needs to be constructed in a tenth of that time or so. And so that's really what creates kind of this tight coupling and this tension about moving fast, but also taking time to figure out how to do it. The other issue is that things don't actually happen equally in time. And so it's much easier to do financial transactions than it is to do construction. It's much easier to do construction than it is to rebuild your social capital in a community. And it's much easier to rebuild your social capital than it is to rebuild your institutions. So these are the observations we've made, is that it's actually, things become out of sequence and they're actually not moving at the same rates. And so it makes it very complicated then again to think about risk reduction in that context. The other issue about time compression is that it's happening spatially at different rates in different places. So the area that was impacted by the disaster has a very different recovery trajectory and sort of compression function than the resettlement area. Resettlement area will have a lot of intense investment early on, and then things will begin to stabilize out. Whereas the other areas take this longer term investment, they might go down for a while before they start to come back up. So insights overall for what does this mean about post-earthquake responses to risk? Like other forms of betterment, community scale risk reduction takes much longer than just simply replacing. And so if there's any one theme to this whole talk, it's that we need to make a better case, and hopefully this data can help us begin to make a better case for investing in pre-disaster mitigation. Because the costs of doing this are actually quite long. Typically, these projects go way over budget, and as much as twice as much over budget. And so we need to actually do more to capture that information and bring that back into the public policy conversation about why it's important to do retrofit ordinances like San Francisco is undertaking for soft stories, or investing in upgrading our water supply systems, et cetera. The second is, as I mentioned, this effects of time compression, that it increases the system interdependencies and also the potential for cascading effects and unintended consequences. The third point I really want to make is that the perceptions of risk change over time. So when you undertake these long-term projects, how people felt about them at the start is likely not going to be how people feel about them as you get further into the project. So that subjects you to both social risk and political risk. And what political risk is so important is, as I said, these projects really require a large amount of public investment. And so that becomes at risk. That should be all large-scale projects required sustained political will and funding. And there are many examples, Managua, Nicaragua, and many more that I could talk about, that are sort of negative examples of what happens, where the decision is made early on, political leaders change, leadership changes, the economy affects budgets, and these projects don't complete it, and you end up with vacant, empty spaces. So with that, I say thank you and open it up to thinking about what this means for the Bay Area before and after the next big one. Yeah, questions? There's a hand over here. So because I'm at Pier and I wear an earthquake hat, I gave an earthquake focus to this, but I also spent a couple of years working in New Orleans after Katrina, and there are a number of other kinds of disasters in which the social issues are really quite large. And they don't come out, except for China, perhaps they are not coming out as significantly in these cases, but they're there. The elderly were displaced permanently in Kobe. The rate of elderly mortality in the years following the recovery was enormous. It's now the same in Tohoku. The rate, now we're at year 5 of elderly mortality has gone up significantly. I would say this is sort of what you're asking is how is that being addressed? I think it's typically still being addressed more in a reactionary style, and the field of thinking about social equity is really coming together everywhere right now, both pre and post disaster, and finally starting to make its way into the conversation. The people in New Orleans rejected the first plan for the city for that reason alone, because so many people had been displaced, and the planning process started within a few months after the hurricane. And so what you saw was that the people who lived on higher ground were the only people that were still in the city. So that really displaced most of the lower economic status people, but also even middle income people. So there were really only the merchants who lived in the French Quarter or worked in the French Quarter and had businesses there, or out towards what's called the Uptown District, which is a much wealthier. Tulane University is out there, traditionally a white neighborhood, an upper income neighborhood. Those were the areas that really were most involved and active in the planning process. And so as people found out about this plan in January, so 5 months after the hurricane, it was presented to the mayor, it was going to be voted on. It had these what are called green dots all over it, but they were areas in which the future viability of the city was actually in question. And that goes not just because of the level of damage, but because the city's sort of physical footprint was actually quite large relative to its population. So it already had something like 40,000 blighted and underutilized properties before Hurricane Katrina. And so the planners rightly were saying, hey, we need to figure out how to essentially organize those and maybe take some places out of redevelopment, take them out of rebuilding. But when people looked at this map, white, black, middle class, lower middle class, lower class, they were shocked at what had happened. And so there was actually a rebellion. There was a march on the meeting, shut the meeting down, and the mayor abandoned the plan. And so on one hand, what came out of that was a much more equitable plan. On the other hand, what came out of that, there was a 2-year delay in really getting another plan process completed. I was involved with that. And what we were really then bound by was to not talk about buyouts anymore as part of the planning process. So really treating risk as part of the redevelopment, that conversation kind of had to be sidelined. And it's actually played out over time as people have essentially not rebuilt in the highest damage areas. So the lowest lying areas, the lowest elevation areas actually have less redevelopment. And that's for a number of things, but the best correlation is really the level of flood damage. It also, some of those areas are rich, some of those areas are poor, some of those areas are white, some of those areas are black. So there are other correlations you can make, but one of the most significant and the one that shows up the most is actually the flood damage. And so it's really a shame that we weren't able to try to get some of that back into that, because I think there was a willingness of people to move away from some of the highest risk areas, and it would have been great if we actually could have offered them that option. So it's complicated. So yes, our Kobe study actually looked at 5 factors and how they facilitated or impeded reconstruction. The first is sort of having a system of land tenure. Some countries don't. In Japan, because the system is actually quite complicated, as I mentioned, there are rights to the land, rights to the structure, and rights to occupancy. In doing a project like this up in Tohoku, finding people who actually have those rights, because the property rights have actually been handed down through multiple generations. So just the process of identifying the rights holders has taken several years, because there are thousands of them in some of these projects. So land tenure is one of those factors that definitely how developed a country's land tenure system is, but also how simple or how manageable it is in the aftermath is definitely a factor. The next factor is just the level of pre-disaster planning, that there's a sophistication of doing that plans exist, that there are these tools that can be used and leveraged, that you're not having to actually create programs in the aftermath and create instruments for the first time. So if you compare, we're actually doing a book right now that compares 3 developing or sort of less westernized places, India, Indonesia, and China, with the United States, Japan, and New Zealand. And this is with my colleague Rob Olshansky, who I do a lot of research with. And so we're actually, what we're seeing in that is that the places that don't have sophisticated planning and don't have those tools really struggle to get going to deal with something like this. And when they do attempt it, and sometimes they fail. The third is this actually the governance structure, having a governance structure in place, and that you can actually make decisions in some sort of non-corrupt and equitable way, which leads you to the fourth, which is participation. What we really feel is that the more participation in this kind of decision making, while it takes longer to do that, there's more buy-in for it. So you might lose time with the planning, but you gain time on the rebuilding because all the stakeholders are engaged. And so in places like New Zealand, we've actually seen where people were really, the government tried to fast track the process, make these decisions pretty much in a very closed room vacuum. And then all of these repercussions and the lack of sort of getting the insurance companies lined up with this idea. So when I say stakeholders, I don't just mean us as households. Think of all the people who need to help you rebuild. Because it's your bank that holds your mortgage, it's wherever your investments are, it's your insurance company. All of these stakeholders need to be engaged as well, not to mention utilities and all the other schools, et cetera. So everything kind of gets out of whack if you don't actually do a more deliberative process. And then the last one, of course, is money. Who has it, who doesn't have it, and whoever has the money in this process really controls, the sort of parameters of the game. So if that ends up being a very, like in the case of China or in New Zealand, it's the national government that's financing this, and Japan as well. In America, we do things in a much more distributed way, so that really that becomes more complicated as to who kind of has the rights. But that really, those are the sort of the 5 factors that we find that really define the successes. But they're not so much, you really can see nuances of that across every landscape as to how successful one project is or another. Well, I think there are lots of debates. What I really appreciate is that better is not, I believe in reducing risk and taking advantage of the opportunity post-disaster to do that, but betterment is more than that, and it is that entire pyramid. And so, one thing that one of my colleagues in Japan really put out is that to do recovery strategies, you really need to be thinking in 3 dimensions. You need to be managing time, you need to be managing the systems, as I showed, and you need to be managing spatially. And if you're not doing all three at once, then you're going to miss something, because they are what I described. They're all sort of more tightly coupled and more interdependent. So I feel that, you know, what's really interesting in the pre-disaster planning work that I just recently was involved with in Oakland, social equity and ensuring that people have a right to return was their #1 goal. And so with that then is going to be a balancing act between risk reduction, buyouts, all those sorts of things. I think, you know, to go back to San Francisco, I think a really interesting point that Haas and Cates made in their work was that really people didn't understand the earthquake danger. And there just wasn't a lot of knowledge about, okay, there was this big hole here. Well, if we just fill it up and we compact it a little bit more, maybe it's fine. You know, so there wasn't that much knowledge about what the future risk was to say that they wanted to change development in a significant way. And I think, you know, in Christchurch, I would say one of the really great aspects of their story is the fact that they are really using science-based information to make these decisions. So the investigation of the land damage is unprecedented in the world in terms of what's been done. And similarly with building damage, but the underlying science that informed where they put the red zone is really, you know, is very factually driven. But then there are all these problems because it was about the houses. And so what about the churches that sat inside the red zone? And what about the dry cleaners that sat inside the red zone? And what about the schools? And so then people sued them for not including them in the red zone. And so then that slowed the whole process down. And so in some ways, I think a lot of as we've gotten more sophisticated with, you know, our legal environment, our regulatory environment, our planning tools, and also just our social awareness, I think things are more complex. So I think we really won't be able to do things very rapidly, even in a future event here.
We have to bring it to an end, and please join me one more time in thanking you.
Thank you for coming.